The steel operating table pressed cold against Dorothy's back, but the chill running through her 73-year-old body had nothing to do with temperature. The surgical lights blazed overhead like Sunday morning sun through the stained glass at Mount Olive Baptist, where she'd been a deacon for 47 years. Her fingers traced the worn gold cross at her throat, the one Mama had given her before the Freedom Riders came through Birmingham in '61. The heart monitor's steady beeping reminded her of Mama's old Singer sewing machine, the one that had stitched together a life from nothing but faith and determination. Dorothy had grown up hearing that rhythm while Mama took in laundry from white folks across town, the same folks who wouldn't let Dorothy drink from their water fountains. Through the operating room's glass partition, she could see Keisha's perfectly straightened hair catching the fluorescent light. Her daughter-in-law stood with arms crossed, designer purse clutched against her cream-colored blazer like armor. The Louboutin heels tapped an impatient rhythm against the hospital's polished floor. Keisha's parents flanked her Mr. and Mrs. Williams, both looking like they'd stepped out of Jet Magazine's society pages. Dr. Peterson adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, reviewing Dorothy's file one final time. The consent form lay on his metal tray, her signature still drying in blue ink. She'd signed her kidney away to save Michael, her firstborn, the son who'd carried her groceries home from Piggly Wiggly since he could walk. A bead of sweat rolled down her temple despite the air conditioning. Her church fan, the one with Dr. King's picture on it, sat in her purse in the waiting room. Right now, she could use its comfort, could use the rhythm of waving it, while Mother Johnson led the congregation in Precious Lord. The anesthesiologist prepared the IV liquid salvation that would take her under while they harvested a piece of her body. Dorothy's hands smoothed the rough cotton of the hospital gown muscle memory from decades of pressing uniforms for the white families in Mountain Brook. Her grandmother had been born into slavery in these same Alabama hills. Now here Dorothy lay, sacrificing herself again, but for family this time. Keisha's voice cut through the glass, sharp enough to slice Sunday ham. Make sure she understands this is non-negotiable. Michael's life depends on her doing the right thing. The words carried the authority of someone who'd graduated summa cum laude from Spelman, who'd married into the prominent Washington family that owned 3 funeral homes across Jefferson County. Dorothy's chest tightened. She remembered the day Keisha had walked into their Ensley Shotgun House designer shoes, clicking against Mama's old linoleum. Michael had been glowing, introducing his new girlfriend, who spoke perfect English, no trace of the South in her voice. Keisha had smiled with teeth white as fresh cotton, but her eyes had measured everything in the room like she was calculating its worth. The nurse adjusted the IV pole, its wheels squeaking like the grocery cart Dorothy pushed through the Western supermarket every Thursday after her shift cleaning offices downtown. She'd worked that job for 38 years, mopping floors and emptying trash cans, invisible to the lawyers and executives who'd dropped papers right at her feet. Mrs. Washington, Dr. Peterson's voice was gentle but professional. Are you ready? Before she could answer, the operating room door exploded inward, like a tornado touching down. Cold air rushed in, making the surgical instruments sing against each other like wind chimes during a summer storm. 9-year-old Malik burst through his Jordans, squeaking against the polished floor. His school uniform from Carver Elementary was wrinkled, his backpack bouncing against his small frame. The security guard behind him was red-faced and puffing, clearly outrun by young legs that had sprinted 6 blocks from the school bus stop. "Grandmama!" Malik's voice cracked with the weight of adult knowledge in a child's throat. "Don't let them cut you. I gotta tell everybody why Daddy really needs your kidney." The entire surgical team froze. Dr. Peterson's hand stopped midway to the anesthesia cart. A nurse dropped her surgical scissors, the metallic clang echoing like church bells announcing emergency prayer meeting. Dorothy's heart hammered against her ribs like her neighbor Mr. Jackson working his heavy bag on his back porch. She tried to sit up, but the restraints held her tight. Her grandson stood there clutching something in his small fist, his face bearing an expression too old for his 9 years. Through the glass, Keisha's controlled facade cracked like ice on the Warrior River during the first warm spell of spring. She pounded on the partition, her Tiffany bracelet catching the light. Don't listen to him. He's confused. Children don't understand medical procedures. But Malik didn't look confused. He pulled out a small recording device, the kind his teacher used for dictation practice. His voice was steady, carrying the same tone Dorothy heard from the pulpit every Sunday when Reverend Williams delivered hard truths. My mama's been giving Daddy medicine that ain't from no doctor. I heard her on the phone saying after Grandmama gives him her kidney, they gonna have enough data to sell to some company overseas. The words hit Dorothy like cold water on sleeping skin. The beeping of the heart monitor accelerated, matching the rhythm of her racing pulse. She thought of all those nights when Keisha had insisted on preparing Michael's medications personally, shooing everyone out of the kitchen like she was protecting state secrets. Dr. Peterson's face darkened like storm clouds gathering over Red Mountain. His voice carried the authority of someone who'd taken the Hippocratic Oath seriously. Stop all preparations immediately. I want security in here now. Keisha's parents moved closer to the glass, their faces masks of concern that couldn't quite hide the calculation behind their eyes. Mrs. Williams adjusted her pearl necklace, the same gesture she made during church service when someone testified about something that made the congregation uncomfortable. Dorothy's vision blurred as memories flooded back like water through a busted levee. Keisha arriving with unmarked pill bottles, Michael growing weaker despite treatment. The hushed phone conversations that stopped whenever Dorothy entered the room. The way Keisha's smile never quite reached her eyes when she spoke about medical procedures. The overhead lights seemed to pulse with the rhythm of her heartbeat. Malik stepped closer to the operating table, his small hand reaching for hers through the restraints. His touch was warm, real, anchoring her to the moment, while everything else felt like quicksand. I recorded some of it, Grandmama, he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of secrets too heavy for young shoulders. I've been watching 'cause something didn't feel right. Mama don't know I heard her talking about selling medicine to folks in other countries. The words settled into Dorothy's consciousness like stones dropping into still water. Each revelation sent ripples through everything she thought she knew about her family, about trust, about the woman who'd sworn to love and honor her son. Dr. Peterson's voice cut through the tension like Reverend Williams calling for altar prayer. Security to OR3 immediately, and I want the police contacted. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, removing the IV from Dorothy's arm while she struggled to process what Malik had revealed. Keisha's pounding on the glass grew more frantic. This is ridiculous! You're listening to a child's fantasies. My husband is dying. But Dorothy could see past the designer clothes and carefully applied makeup now. The way Keisha's left eye twitched when she was cornered, same as it had during that awkward Thanksgiving dinner when Dorothy had asked too many questions about Michael's new medications. Security arrived, 2 officers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else than dealing with family drama in a hospital. Dorothy sat up slowly, her hospital gown twisted around her legs. The anesthesia that was supposed to knock her unconscious for surgery made her feel cotton-headed instead. Ma'am, we need to understand what's happening here, the older security guard said, his nameplate reading Johnson. Dorothy recognized the careful politeness black folks used when addressing elders, even in uniform. Malik stepped forward, still clutching his recording device like a lifeline. My grandmama was about to give my daddy her kidney, but my mama's been making him sick on purpose with medicine that ain't supposed to help him. The room felt like Sunday service when someone testified about something that made everyone shift in their seats. Dr. Peterson studied Malik with the intensity of a doctor examining symptoms. Son, these are very serious accusations. Do you have proof? Dorothy watched her grandson's face transform from frightened child to determined witness. He reminded her of herself at 9, standing up to the bus driver who'd made her mama sit in the back even when the white section was half empty. "Yes, sir." Malik's thumb moved across the device's buttons with the confidence of a generation raised on technology. "I recorded her talking on the phone about selling medicine to people in other countries. And I got pictures of her meeting with a man who gives her money." Through the partition, Dorothy could see Keisha whispering urgently to her parents. Mr. Williams pulled out his cell phone, probably calling his lawyer. The same lawyer who'd helped them buy that big house in Vestavia Hills, the one Dorothy had always wondered how they afforded on Michael's construction worker salary. A nurse Dorothy hadn't noticed before stepped forward. Young woman couldn't be more than 25, with natural hair pulled back in a bun and scrubs that had seen too many double shifts. Her name tag read Jasmine. "Doctor, I've been wondering about something," Jasmine said, her voice carrying the musical quality of someone raised in Mississippi Delta country. "Mrs. Washington's son has been getting medications that aren't in our computer system. His wife always brings them from a specialist downtown, but when I tried to look up the prescribing doctor, the license number doesn't match any physician in Alabama." Dorothy's blood ran cold as winter morning before the heat kicked on. She thought about all those times Keisha had insisted on handling Michael's medication schedule, keeping the pills in a locked box that only she had the key to. Dr. Peterson's face darkened like storm clouds gathering over downtown Birmingham. "Nurse, get me Michael Washington's complete medical file. I want every medication documented, every blood test result, everything." He turned to security. "And I want that family detained until we can sort this out." The security guards moved toward the glass partition where Keisha and her parents waited. Dorothy could see Mrs. Williams' face go ashen beneath her carefully applied foundation. The woman who'd always acted like she was doing Dorothy's family a favor by accepting Michael into theirs now looked like she'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. Malik tugged on Dorothy's hospital gown. "Grandmama, there's more. I heard Mama talking to someone about testing medicine on sick people. She said after you gave Daddy your kidney, they'd have enough information to sell to companies that make medicine for people in Africa and other places where they don't check real good." The words hit Dorothy like a slap from an unexpected hand. She thought about her great-grandfather who'd been used for medical experiments during slavery times. Stories passed down through generations about doctors who treated black bodies like they were worth less than livestock. Dr. Peterson was already on his phone speaking in rapid medical terminology that Dorothy couldn't follow. But she caught enough words. Experimental drugs, unlicensed trials, immediate investigation, to understand that Malik had uncovered something much bigger than a family betrayal. Jasmine leaned closer to Dorothy, her voice low enough that only she could hear. "Mrs. Washington, I've been working here 3 years and I've seen patterns. Patients come in with kidney problems, their families push for transplants from elderly relatives, and the paperwork always gets rushed through by the same doctors. Most of the families have money. Nice cars, fancy clothes." Dorothy's hands found her cross again, working the worn gold between her fingers like worry beads. "You think this has happened before?" "I think your grandson just uncovered something that goes way deeper than one family," Jasmine whispered. "I've been keeping records on my own time documenting things that didn't make sense. If you're willing, I'd like to help you get to the bottom of this." Through the glass, Dorothy could see Keisha arguing with the security guards, her voice raised high enough to carry through the partition. "This is a misunderstanding. My husband is sick and his mother volunteered to help. We're not criminals." But her parents looked like they'd swallowed something sour. Mr. Williams kept checking his expensive watch, while Mrs. Williams clutched her Chanel purse like it contained state secrets. Dorothy thought about the past 6 months, how Keisha had gradually taken over Michael's medical care. The way she'd insisted on driving him to appointments, handling insurance paperwork, managing his medication schedule, always claiming she wanted to help to take the burden off Dorothy's aging shoulders. "Ma'am?" Security guard Johnson stood beside her bed, his expression respectful but serious. "We're going to need a statement from you about what you know regarding your son's medical treatment." Dorothy nodded, her voice finding strength from somewhere deep in her chest. the same place she'd drawn courage from when she'd marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge as a teenager, when she'd insisted on registering to vote, despite threats from local officials. "Officer, I've been a fool. My daughter-in-law convinced me that donating my kidney was the only way to save my son, but she's been controlling everything about his medical care, keeping me away from his doctors, handling all his medications herself." Dorothy's voice grew stronger with each word. "I trusted her because she married into my family, but trust and blood don't always mean the same thing." Malik climbed up onto a chair beside her bed, his small hand finding hers. "Grandmama, I was scared to tell anybody, 'cause Mama said if I ever talked about family business to strangers, Child Services would take me away and put me with people who don't love me." The manipulation cut deep. Dorothy had heard those same threats used against children in her community for generations. The fear that speaking truth would destroy families, that outsiders couldn't be trusted to understand their situation. Dr. Peterson returned his face, grim. "Mrs. Washington, I've contacted the State Medical Board and the FBI. What your grandson has uncovered appears to be part of a larger investigation into illegal drug trials targeting elderly African Americans for organ harvesting and experimental medication testing." The words settled over Dorothy like a heavy quilt on a cold night. She thought about all the times she'd felt like something wasn't right, but had silenced her own instincts to keep peace in the family. How many other grandmothers were lying on operating tables right now, about to sacrifice their bodies for a lie? The conference room at University Hospital felt like the community center where Dorothy had attended countless church meetings, except instead of folding chairs and coffee urns, polished mahogany and official badges surrounded her. Detective Martinez, a compact woman with graying temples and eyes that had seen too much, sat across from Dorothy with a digital recorder between them. "Mrs. Washington, I need you to understand that what your grandson uncovered is connected to a multi-state investigation we've been running for 8 months. Detective Martinez's voice carried the weariness of someone who'd worked too many cases involving vulnerable populations. "Your daughter-in-law and her parents are part of a network that targets elderly Black families, convincing them to donate organs while simultaneously testing unregistered medications on the recipients." Dorothy's hands wrapped around a styrofoam cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Through the conference room's windows, she could see Birmingham's skyline, the same view she'd watched change over decades of cleaning office buildings downtown. Now those buildings felt like monuments to a city that had always found new ways to exploit her people. Malik sat beside her drawing pictures on a legal pad while social worker Mrs. Chen observed quietly from the corner. The boy had been through enough questioning for one day, but he'd refused to leave Dorothy's side. "Detective, how long has this been going on?" Dorothy's voice was steady, drawing strength from the same well that had sustained her through Jim Crow, through raising 2 sons as a single mother after her husband died in Vietnam, through decades of making something from nothing. "We believe at least 3 years in this region. The scheme is sophisticated. They identify elderly African Americans with adult children suffering from kidney disease, often after deliberately inducing that disease through contaminated medications. They build trust through community connections, churches, social organizations." Dorothy thought about how Keisha had joined Mount Olive Baptist within months of marrying Michael, how she'd volunteered for the Mother's Auxiliary, brought pound cakes to potluck dinners donated generously to the building fund. All of it designed to gain credibility within the community that had raised Dorothy. "They chose your family specifically because of your reputation," Detective Martinez continued. "Church deacon retired from 38 years of cleaning offices downtown, known for self-sacrifice and devotion to family. You were the perfect candidate. Someone whose community would support the decision to donate, whose own modesty would prevent you from questioning medical authority." The profiling stung because it was accurate. Dorothy had spent her entire life putting others first, accepting whatever help was offered, without asking too many questions. The same survival instincts that had protected her through decades of systemic racism had made her vulnerable to this particular predation. Jasmine knocked and entered carrying a thick folder. Still in her scrubs, she looked like she hadn't slept since yesterday. "Mrs. Washington, I've been working with the detective to compile evidence from other cases. I want to show you something." She spread photos across the conference table. Dorothy recognized some faces. Elderly men and women from around Birmingham, people she'd seen at community events or grocery stores. All black, all between 60 and 80 years old. These patients all had family members who received kidney transplants from elderly relatives over the past 2 years. In every case, the recipients had been treated with unregistered medications before developing kidney failure. And in every case, the transplant coordinators were connected to the same pharmaceutical company that paid your daughter-in-law. Dorothy studied the faces, seeing herself reflected in their weathered features. People who'd worked their entire lives, raised families, contributed to their communities, only to become targets for exploitation in their golden years. "How many of the donors survived?" Dorothy asked, though she dreaded the answer. Detective Martinez's silence stretched like the pause between lightning and thunder. "Mrs. Washington, elderly organ donors face significant risks even under legitimate circumstances. When combined with the stress of discovering family betrayal and the complications these people faced from contaminated blood work." Dorothy didn't need her to finish. She understood that speaking out today might save other families, but it couldn't bring back the grandmothers who'd already sacrificed everything based on lies. Mrs. Chen leaned forward from her corner chair. "Mrs. Washington, we need to discuss Malik's safety. His mother and grandparents will likely be charged with federal crimes, which means custody arrangements will need to be addressed." Malik looked up from his drawing, a picture of what appeared to be Dorothy and him standing in front of a house with a garden. "I want to stay with Grandmama. I don't want to live with people who hurt my daddy." The simplicity of childhood cutting through adult complexity. Dorothy reached for his hand, her own trembling slightly. She'd raised 2 sons on her own, but at 73, taking on a 9-year-old felt like climbing Red Mountain in Sunday shoes. "Ma'am, there's something else," Detective Martinez said, pulling out another folder. "We've been monitoring communications between your daughter-in-law and her contacts overseas. The medications they were testing weren't just experimental. They were being developed specifically for markets in Africa and South America, where regulatory oversight is less stringent." The global scope made Dorothy's head spin. She thought about her great-grandfather's stories of medical experiments during slavery, how black bodies had always been seen as available for scientific exploitation. Now that same legacy was being extended across oceans, using American families as testing grounds for medications intended for other vulnerable populations. "What do you need from me, Detective?" "We need you to help us build the strongest possible case. That means documenting everything. Every conversation with Keisha about Michael's medical care, every time she insisted on handling his medications, every instance where she discouraged you from speaking directly with his doctors." Dorothy nodded, her memory already working backward through months of subtle manipulation. The way Keisha had convinced her that asking questions would make doctors think she didn't trust them. How she'd gradually taken over all communication with medical professionals, claiming she was protecting Dorothy from stress. "And, Mrs. Washington," Detective Martinez's voice grew gentler, "we need you to be prepared for what this case might uncover about your son's condition. Preliminary blood work suggests the kidney damage was artificially induced, which means Michael might recover without needing a transplant at all." Dorothy finished the sentence, relief and rage warring in her chest like competing sermon messages. Jasmine pulled up a chair beside Dorothy. "Mrs. Washington, I've been working with a nephrology specialist at UAB. Dr. Williams, no relation to your daughter-in-law's family, believes that with proper treatment and removal of the contaminating medications, your son's kidney function could improve significantly within 6 months." The possibility that Michael might recover completely shifted something fundamental in Dorothy's understanding of the situation. This wasn't just about preventing her exploitation. It was about saving her son from unnecessary medical procedures while exposing a network that had targeted their community specifically because of their vulnerability and their loyalty to family. Detective Martinez, I want to help you catch every person involved in this scheme. But I need to know that when this is over, my grandson will be safe and my son will be healthy. Dorothy's voice carried the authority of someone making a covenant, the same tone she used when accepting new responsibilities as a church deacon. Mrs. Washington, I can't promise this will be easy. Your daughter-in-law's family has resources connections. They'll try to make this about a misunderstanding about cultural differences in medical decision-making. They'll attempt to portray you as a confused elderly woman who misunderstood modern medical procedures. Dorothy thought about the decades she'd spent being underestimated, how people had looked at her uniform and assumed she was ignorant, invisible. Now that same tendency to dismiss Black women might work in her favor. They'd never expect someone like her to understand the complexity of their scheme well enough to help bring it down. Then let them underestimate me, Dorothy said, her voice gaining the strength that had carried her through 7 decades of challenges. I've been underestimated before. It's usually the last mistake people make when dealing with me. The federal courthouse in downtown Birmingham rose like a monument to justice that Dorothy had learned not to trust easily. She'd seen too many verdicts that protected the powerful while punishing the vulnerable. But today, walking up those marble steps with Malik's hand in hers and Detective Martinez beside them, she felt the weight of generations pushing her forward. The courthouse lobby buzzed with reporters and cameras, drawn by a story that checked every box for media attention. Medical fraud, family betrayal, exploitation of elderly African Americans. Dorothy kept her head high, remembering her grandmother's advice about walking with dignity, even when the world tried to break your spirit. Mrs. Washington, a young reporter thrust a microphone toward her face. How does it feel to know your own daughter-in-law was using you for medical experiments? Detective Martinez stepped between them. Mrs. Washington will be making a statement after the proceedings. But Dorothy touched the detective's arm gently, the same gesture she'd used to calm countless children in her years of community work. I'll answer that, Dorothy said, her voice carrying across the lobby. It feels like discovering that someone you trusted with your family's life saw you as nothing more than a test subject. But it also feels like justice finally catching up with people who prey on grandmothers who love their children too much to ask hard questions. The courthouse steps had seen many historic moments, but today they witnessed something different, an elderly Black woman refusing to be ashamed of her exploitation, claiming her voice in a system that had spent centuries trying to silence it. Inside courtroom 3B, Dorothy found herself facing Keisha across an aisle that might as well have been the Grand Canyon. Her daughter-in-law wore a conservative navy suit, her hair pulled back in a style calculated to suggest humility and remorse. But Dorothy could see the calculation in her eyes, the same look she'd worn when convincing Dorothy that donating her kidney was a moral obligation. Keisha's parents sat behind her, their expensive clothes and jewelry at odds with their current circumstances. Mr. Williams kept checking his phone until the bailiff told him to put it away. Mrs. Williams stared straight ahead, her pearl necklace catching the courtroom's fluorescent lights like tears she refused to shed. Federal prosecutor Sarah Chen stood to address the judge, her voice crisp and professional. Your Honor, the defendants stand accused of orchestrating a scheme that targeted elderly African Americans for illegal medical experimentation while simultaneously preparing to harvest their organs under false pretenses. The charges read like a litany of betrayal, conspiracy to commit medical fraud, elder abuse, international trafficking of unregistered pharmaceuticals, and attempted organ trafficking. Each count carried potential decades in prison. Mrs. Washington. Prosecutor Chen addressed Dorothy directly. Would you please tell the court how the defendants convinced you to donate your kidney? Dorothy stood slowly, her church dress pressed, and her hair styled the way she'd worn it to every important occasion for 40 years. She thought about all the times she'd given testimony in church, sharing struggles and victories with people who understood her journey. "Your Honor, my daughter-in-law told me it was my duty as a mother to save my son. She said the doctors confirmed I was the only compatible donor, that without my kidney, Michael would die." Dorothy's voice grew stronger with each word. "She used my love for my child and my respect for medical authority to convince me to sacrifice my body for what I thought was his survival." "And did Mrs. Keisha Williams provide your son with medications during his illness?" "Yes, ma'am. She controlled everything about his medical care, kept his pills in a locked box, insisted on driving him to all appointments, handled all communication with his doctors. When I asked questions, she told me I was being overprotective, that my concerns were causing Michael stress that might make him sicker." Prosecutor Chen walked to the evidence table, lifting a clear plastic bag containing pill bottles. "Mrs. Washington, do you recognize these?" Dorothy studied the unmarked containers, remembering Keisha's careful ritual of administering Michael's daily medications. "Those look like the pills Keisha gave Michael every morning and evening. She said they were prescribed by a specialist downtown, but she never let me see the bottles up close." "Your Honor," Prosecutor Chen addressed the judge, "laboratory analysis reveals these pills contained compounds designed to gradually damage kidney function while creating symptoms that would necessitate transplantation. The medication was manufactured by a pharmaceutical company that paid Mrs. Keisha Williams and her parents over $200,000 for their participation in illegal human trials." The courtroom stirred like Sunday congregation when someone testified about backsliding. Dorothy felt the same mix of shock and recognition she'd experienced hearing neighbors confess to adultery or theft during church testimony time. Keisha's defense attorney, a slick-looking man who probably charged more per hour than Dorothy had made in a month, stood to object. "Your Honor, my client was acting on medical advice from licensed physicians. Mrs. Williams believed she was helping her husband receive cutting-edge treatment for a serious illness." But Prosecutor Chen was ready. "Your Honor, we have recorded conversations between Mrs. Williams and her pharmaceutical contact discussing the deliberate induction of kidney failure and the recruitment of elderly family members for organ donation. This was not medical treatment. It was systematic exploitation." The prosecutor played audio recordings through the courtroom's speakers. Keisha's voice filled the space, cold and calculating, as she discussed managing the old woman's concerns and ensuring compliance with the donation schedule. Dorothy listened to her daughter-in-law discussing her like a laboratory animal, her voice stripped of any warmth or humanity. The woman who'd brought pound cakes to church dinners was revealed as someone who'd calculated the exact amount of emotional manipulation needed to convince a grandmother to sacrifice her life. "Mrs. Washington," the defense attorney approached during cross-examination, his voice patronizing in the way that made Dorothy's teeth clench. "Isn't it possible you misunderstood conversations between medical professionals? At your age, with the stress of your son's illness, couldn't these recordings represent legitimate medical discussions that you interpreted incorrectly?" Dorothy looked at the lawyer, seeing in his condescending tone every white man who'd ever questioned her intelligence, her memory, her right to speak truth about her own experiences. She thought about her grandmother, who'd been dismissed as unreliable when she testified about plantation conditions, and her mother, whose complaints about workplace discrimination had been labeled confusion and emotional instability. "Son," Dorothy said, her voice carrying the authority of 7 decades of experience, "I may be 73 years old, but I've been listening to people lie to me since before you were born. I know the difference between medical discussions and criminal planning. Your client wasn't trying to help my son. She was using him to get to me and using both of us to make money from a pharmaceutical company that tests drugs on people who can't afford to say no." The courtroom fell silent. Even the court reporter looked up from her machine, struck by the clarity and power of Dorothy's response. Judge Harrison, an older Black woman whose own experiences with systemic bias showed in her careful attention to every detail, leaned forward. Mrs. Williams, before I pass sentence, do you have anything to say to Mrs. Washington regarding your actions? Keisha stood, her composure finally cracking. Tears that might have been genuine rolled down her cheeks as she turned toward Dorothy. I'm sorry, Mama D. I never meant for it to go this far. We needed the money, and they said nobody would get hurt, that the medications were basically safe. The apology felt hollow, scripted by lawyers who understood that remorse might reduce sentencing. Dorothy looked at her daughter-in-law and felt nothing but pity for someone who'd traded family trust for pharmaceutical money. Keisha, Dorothy said quietly, I forgave you the moment my grandson told me the truth, but forgiveness doesn't mean freedom from consequences. You used my love for my child to nearly kill me, and you poisoned my son to cover your tracks. That's not something sorry can fix. Judge Harrison's voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too many vulnerable people exploited by those they trusted most. Mrs. Keisha Williams, I sentence you to 15 years in federal prison. Mr. and Mrs. Williams, you are each sentenced to 12 years. Additionally, all defendants will be required to pay restitution to Mrs. Washington and contribute to a fund supporting other victims of medical exploitation. The gavel's bang echoed through the courtroom like church doors closing after a sinner's confession. Dorothy felt no joy in the verdict, only relief that justice had been served and other families might be protected from similar exploitation. 6 months after the trial, Dorothy sat on her front porch in Ensley watching Malik practice basketball shots at the community center across the street. The house felt different now, lighter somehow, as if Keisha's deception had been a shadow that lifted when truth emerged. The early morning sun painted everything gold, reminding her of Sunday service light streaming through stained glass. Michael walked up the front steps slowly. His color improved, but his spirit still healing from learning that his wife had poisoned him for pharmaceutical money. The doctors at UAB had been right. Once the contaminated medications were removed from his system, his kidney function had steadily improved. No transplant needed, no surgery required, just time and proper medical care. Morning, Mama, Michael said, settling into the chair beside her. At 45, he looked older than his years, aged by betrayal and recovery. Malik's basketball skills are improving. That boy's got determination, Dorothy replied, watching her grandson sink another shot. Reminds me of someone else I know. The settlement money from the pharmaceutical company had arrived last week, enough to ensure Malik's education through college and provide security for Dorothy's remaining years. But more importantly, the case had exposed a network that had targeted dozens of families across the Southeast, leading to federal legislation, strengthening oversight of experimental drug trials and organ donation procedures. Detective Martinez had visited the previous month with updates on the ongoing investigation. The pharmaceutical company had been fined $50 million and barred from operating in the United States. 3 doctors had lost their licenses, and 2 hospital administrators faced federal charges for their role in facilitating the scheme. Mama, I keep thinking about what would have happened if Malik hadn't spoken up. Michael said, his voice heavy with guilt that Dorothy had been trying to help him release for months. Son, we can't live in the land of what if, Dorothy replied, using the same words she'd heard her own mother speak after surviving decades of Jim Crow violence. What matters is what did happen. Your boy was brave enough to speak truth, and we were strong enough to listen. The front door opened, and Malik bounded out, basketball still tucked under his arm, and school backpack bouncing against his shoulders. At 10 now, he'd grown 2 inches and gained the confidence that came from being heard and believed by adults when it mattered most. Grandmama, guess what Mrs. Johnson says I can write my social studies report about our court case? She says it's an important example of how regular people can fight back against powerful companies that try to hurt their communities. Dorothy smiled, remembering her own school days when teachers had discouraged students from discussing anything that might be considered controversial. Times changed slowly but surely. That sounds like a fine topic, baby. Just remember to write about how many people helped make justice happen. It wasn't just our family fighting alone. The truth of that statement had become clearer over the months following the trial. Jasmine had been promoted to charge nurse and was working with federal investigators to identify other potential victims. Dr. Williams at UAB had established a clinic specifically for elderly patients who suspected they'd been victims of medical exploitation. Even Reverend Thompson at Mount Olive Baptist had started a support group for families recovering from elder abuse. "I got a letter from college yesterday," Malik announced, pulling a wrinkled envelope from his backpack. "The admissions counselor says because of the newspaper articles about our case, some scholarship programs want to make sure I have money for school when I'm old enough." Dorothy's eyes filled with unexpected tears. Malik's courage in speaking truth had not only saved her life and exposed criminal exploitation, but had opened doors for his own future that might never have existed otherwise. Michael reached over and squeezed her hand. "Mama, I know I can't undo the fact that I trusted Keisha when I should have listened to my own family. But I want you to know that watching you handle everything with such dignity taught me something about real strength." The forgiveness between them had come gradually built through honest conversations about trust manipulation and the way criminals exploit family love to achieve their goals. Michael had entered counseling to process his wife's betrayal, while Dorothy had found peace through her church community and the knowledge that speaking out had protected other families. Mrs. Chen, the social worker, had visited monthly during Malik's adjustment period. The boy had thrived, living with Dorothy, his grades improving, and his natural leadership skills emerging as he helped younger children at the community center understand that adults don't always know best and that children's voices matter when they witness wrongdoing. "Grandmama," Malik said, settling cross-legged on the porch beside her chair, "I've been thinking about something. Remember how scared I was to tell about Mama's phone calls and the pictures I took?" Dorothy nodded, remembering the fear in his young eyes as he'd struggled with the weight of adult secrets. "Well, I was scared because grown-ups always say children should respect their elders and not question what adults tell them. But you taught me that respect doesn't mean staying quiet when someone's doing wrong, even if that someone is family." The wisdom in her grandson's words reminded Dorothy of lessons learned through decades of navigating systems designed to silence her voice. She'd taught him that survival sometimes required speaking uncomfortable truths, even when those truths disrupted family peace. A car pulled up in front of the house, and Detective Martinez stepped out, carrying a folder and wearing the satisfied expression of someone bearing good news. "Mrs. Washington, I wanted to update you on the national investigation your case started," the detective said, settling into the third porch chair. "We've identified 47 families across 12 states who were targeted by similar schemes. Because of your testimony and Malik's evidence, we've been able to prosecute multiple pharmaceutical companies and prevent hundreds of elderly people from unnecessary surgery." The scope of their victory felt overwhelming. Dorothy thought about the faces in those courthouse photos, other grandmothers who might have died believing they were saving their children when they were actually being exploited for corporate profit. "Detective, what happened to the other families, the ones who went through with the surgeries?" "Some of the donors didn't survive, Mrs. Washington, but 17 elderly people who were scheduled for organ donation procedures were able to cancel their surgeries after seeing news coverage of your case. Their family members are receiving proper medical treatment now, and several have made full recoveries." 17 lives saved because one 9-year-old boy had found the courage to challenge adult authority, and one grandmother had chosen to believe him over family members who claimed to love her. As the sun climbed higher, painting the neighborhood in warm light that reminded Dorothy of Sunday morning hymns, she felt the deep satisfaction that came from surviving trials that would have broken a weaker spirit. The house that had once felt heavy with deception now buzzed with the energy of 3 generations, learning to trust each other completely. Malek, she said, watching him practice dribbling while listening to the adults talk. What do you want to be when you grow up? He stopped bouncing the ball and looked at her with serious eyes that still held traces of the fear he'd carried while keeping family secrets. I want to be someone who helps kids tell the truth when adults are doing wrong things. Maybe a lawyer or a detective or something that protects families. Dorothy smiled, seeing in her grandson's determination the same spirit that had carried her through 7 decades of challenges. She thought about her great-grandfather, who'd survived slavery, and her grandmother, who'd lived through Jim Crow, and her mother, who'd worked for integration. Each generation had fought for dignity and justice in their own way. Now it was Malik's turn to carry that legacy forward, armed with the knowledge that speaking truth required courage, but that silence in the face of wrongdoing was its own form of betrayal. The porch felt like a sanctuary as the 3 of them sat together, watching the neighborhood wake up around them. Children walked to school, neighbors headed to work, life continuing with the steady rhythm of a community that had learned to take care of its own. Dorothy closed her eyes and listened to the sounds of morning in Ensley, car doors closing, dogs barking, children calling to each other across yards. These were the sounds of survival of families who'd found ways to thrive, despite systems designed to exploit their love and loyalty. She thought about Keisha serving 15 years in federal prison and wondered if her former daughter-in-law understood, yet that real family meant protecting each other's lives, not profiting from them. Forgiveness had come slowly and painfully, but it had freed Dorothy from carrying anger that would have poisoned her remaining years. "Grandmama," Malik said, settling against her chair, "do you think other kids are brave enough to speak up when they know something's wrong?" Dorothy looked down at her grandson, seeing in his question the hope of a generation that might not have to choose between family loyalty and moral courage. "Baby," she said, her voice carrying the wisdom of ancestors who'd spoken truth in far more dangerous circumstances. "I think children are naturally brave. It's adults who teach them to be afraid of truth. But every time one child finds the courage to speak up like you did, it makes it easier for the next child to do the same thing." The morning sun climbed higher, promising another day of healing growth, and the quiet satisfaction that came from surviving betrayal with dignity intact and love stronger than before.